With less than a month to go as a Senator, Rex Patrick isn't going quietly amid growing concerns over our gas supply. The Senator is slamming the industry as a cartel and calling on the government to step up. The outgoing Senator joins me here in the studio. Senator Patrick, thanks so much for your time. As you point out, we produce more gas than any other country on earth, the largest exporter, yet we're paying some of the highest prices in the world. What is your critique on how we got to this point?
Well, there's two things that are missing, sadly, in the Australian context. Firstly, we don't receive the proper amount of royalties for the gas that we export. So we export an equivalent amount of LNG as Qatar. They, in 2021, received $26 billion in royalties to consolidated revenue. Australia received $800 million. There's a huge difference there. The second part of the story is that, and we need to understand, this is our gas. This is gas that is owned by Australians. It's being exported overseas. We actually produce about 2.5 times more than what we need. It's being exported overseas, and our domestic market is therefore tight in terms of supply, and we're paying basically what overseas markets are paying. Now, this gas ought to be used as an advantage for Australia, for Australian manufacturers. It's an advantage that is bestowed upon Australia, but we've just given it all away. In Western Australia, we have a gas reservation policy where 15% of the gas produced is directed at the domestic market. We don't have that on the East Coast, and it's essential that we move towards that situation so that Australians...
Can that be done relatively easily in your view? Because obviously a lot of the gas has been tied up in export contracts and that sort of thing, but it seems to me that if a government was ever going to do it, now's the time. There would be political goodwill towards such a notion given the cost of living crisis that people are experiencing right now.
The Labor government has to do something, and rather than just have or take the gas cartels to the brink and get some short-term relief, it's time we deal with this matter systematically. We can move to a gas reservation policy. People need to understand that when the gas trains were put in place in Gladstone, the gas companies made a commitment or gave an undertaking that in exporting gas, the domestic market would not be disturbed. They have breached that undertaking. So there's no sovereign risk involved in us implementing a gas reservation scheme because it's a remedy to a breach of undertaking.
There's also an expansion of capacity on the very near-term horizon. I spoke to Madeleine King earlier in this hour, and she made that very point, that the capacity will grow in the near term. So it seems to reinforce the argument that a reservation could be achieved, capacity increases, isolate at least a percentage of that for domestic use.
It is gas that belongs to Australians. Australians have a right to a fair and reasonable price for our gas. It's our resource. And,
But that's separate to the, I guess that's our domestic consumption in terms of price that we pay. But you say as well that there needs to be a greater royalty paid as well. But that looks unlikely. The government seems like it's knocking on the head this idea of a super profits tax, which we know there is a history there for Labor.
Yeah, look, the PRRT, the Petroleum Resource Tax, has been in place since 1998. It's had little tweaks from back then all the way through the Callaghan Review, and we have simply seen a very flat level of royalty, very small amount, whilst gas revenues have just skyrocketed for these gas companies. And of course, they are resisting any change in the status quo. Why wouldn't they? They've got commercial interests, but we have to put the national interest ahead of any commercial.
Do you believe they are breaching their social contract with the country within which they're operating here?
Absolutely. They need to recognise that this resource, it's a finite resource, it belongs to Australians. We grant a licence for them to export it overseas, and we don't mind them making a profit, but they have to look after the hand that feeds them.
Could the trigger, that domestic gas trigger, which would divert exports to domestic use, could that be transitioned into a type of East Coast or reservation policy? Can that be brought forward in that sense?
I think there is scope to do that, and I say that with knowledge. I was the person that originally, on behalf of Nick Xenophon, negotiated with Matthias Cormann the trigger, the Australian Australian domestic gas security mechanism. Originally, that was put in place because people were coming to South Australia to Nick Xenophon and saying, we can't even get a gas offer, let alone a price. So the trigger was put in place to make sure there was enough supply. And it was actually successful in doing that, except that the supply was kept tight. So in 2019, the trigger was again modified, with me negotiating, to then put a price comparison in, because at that point in time we saw that Asian gas markets were getting gas cheaper, Australian gas cheaper than the Australian market. Again, that fixed that problem. We're now in 2022.
So, but that trigger can be used, do you believe, as a reservation type policy if it's amended?
Yes. So we're now in 2022 with a different problem, and that is that the international price is high, and we're paying that international price. That trigger is actually framed up in regulation. It does not require the Parliament to approve it, and you can do things like change the wording from supply year, which is how they look at it, and that's the reason why the trigger can only be implemented from the start of a year, from January. You could change that, for example, to words like supply period, and have the period determined by the minister. So there's all sorts of things that can be done immediately to get a resolution to the problem. But I would like to see a proper dealing with the systematic problem of lack of royalties, and making sure that we get a good price, a good and fair price that gives our manufacturers an advantage.
Do you think that royalties question can be done without all of the drama that we saw with the mining tax?
I think it has to be done. Look, there will be drama, there will be kickback, and the gas industry will vehemently oppose it, but the Australian population will embrace it and will reward a government that has the courage to stand up to the gas cartel.
You're a former submariner. We've seen some drama on that front as well, with the submarine acquisitions and now this capability gap. To wrap up this afternoon, give our viewers a sense of what you think the government should do to ensure that we don't have a capability gap with our submarine capacity.
The Future Submarine program was born in 2009. We were supposed to start construction of a future submarine in 2016. We're now at 2022, 13 years later, having spent $6 billion with nothing to show for it. Going with AUKUS is just crazy. It is a program that has a first delivery in 2040. That's like preparing a good football team to arrive after the grand final. And it's going to cost $171 billion, which is just unaffordable. We need to move to a very low-risk path. With an off-the-shelf submarine, we could have construction starting in Adelaide in 2 to 3 years' time for delivery of a first submarine in perhaps 6 years from now, and making sure our submariners, who don't just deal with issues, for example, fighting a conflict, they're always involved in things like intelligence gathering. They're doing that sort of stuff now. We need to make sure they've got the right equipment, the best equipment to do that job.
And you believe an off-the-shelf option. What sort of option would you go to now? You know the area well. What's one that would suit us right now?
Okay, so we can go to either the Japanese or the Germans. They have submarines that are off the shelf that can be built here in Australia. They may not be perfect, which is what our admirals are pushing for, But it's just like when you go looking for a car, you set out a list of requirements of, you know, whether it has to go off-road, whether it has to have 4 seats, how big the boot ought to be. You will never find a car that exactly meets your requirements. So you find the one that is closest and that is within your price range, and that's what we now need to do with our Submarine force.
Well, congratulations on your service in the Parliament, Senator Rex Patrick. I appreciate your time today and over several years. Thank you.
Thank you.